There is a thought you return to without deciding to return to it, a pattern you repeat without choosing to repeat it, an interpretation you apply automatically to situations that do not require that interpretation. And the repetition is not conscious. The repetition is structural. It is the result of a pathway that has been traveled so many times it no longer requires effort to activate. The mind does not ask whether the thought is accurate. The mind does not evaluate whether the interpretation serves the current circumstance. The mind simply defaults to what has been repeated most often. And what has been repeated most often becomes what feels true. Not because it is true, but because it is familiar. And familiar is confused with correct. Familiar is the pathway that requires the least energy to activate. And energy conservation is not a choice the mind makes. Energy conservation is how the mind operates. The mind routes thought along paths of least resistance, and paths of least resistance are paths that have been traveled most frequently, and frequency creates structure, and structure is not temporary. Structure is the physical reorganization of how signals move through the system, and once structure is established, the structure governs which thoughts appear, and which thoughts do not. Tesla understood that the mind is not abstract. The mind is electrical. It is a system of signals moving through matter, and signals do not move randomly. Signals follow paths, and paths are created through repetition. The first time a thought occurs, the signal must create a new route. The resistance is high, the effort is noticeable, but the second time the same thought occurs, the signal follows the route created by the first instance. The resistance is lower, the effort is reduced, and by the 100th repetition, the route is so established that the signal travels automatically, without effort, without awareness. And automatic signal routing is what most people call thinking, but it is not thinking. It is pattern execution. It is the activation of a pathway that was formed through repetition and now operates without requiring conscious intent. And pathways that operate without conscious intent feel like identity. They feel like who you are, but they are not who you are. They are what you have repeated, and what you have repeated is not fixed. What you have repeated is simply what was repeated most often under the conditions that were present when the repetition occurred. The condition of fixed thought is not the result of a single decision. It is the result of thousands of repetitions. Repetitions that occurred without observation, without evaluation, without recognition that each repetition was strengthening a structure, and strengthened structures become permanent unless the conditions change. But conditions do not change through intention. Conditions change through environment, through the removal of stimuli that trigger the automatic pathway, through the introduction of interference that prevents the signal from completing its familiar route. And interference is not distraction. Interference is the deliberate disruption of automaticity, the prevention of the mind from defaulting to the pathway it prefers. And prevention is not suppression. Suppression is the attempt to stop the signal after it has already activated. Prevention is the removal of the conditions that activate the signal in the first place. And removal of conditions is environmental, not mental. It is the alteration of what the mind is exposed to, not the alteration of what the mind does with what it is exposed to. Fixed thought produces fixed perception. Perception is not observation of reality. Perception is interpretation of signal. And interpretation is always filtered through existing structure, through pathways that have already been established, through patterns that have already been repeated. And patterns that have already been repeated determine what is noticed and what is ignored. The mind does not perceive everything. The mind perceives what matches existing structure, what confirms existing pathways, what allows existing patterns to continue executing without interruption. And patterns that execute without interruption feel effortless, they feel natural, they feel like the obvious interpretation of what is occurring. But the interpretation is not obvious. The interpretation is automatic. It is the result of structure built through repetition. And structure built through repetition does not evaluate whether the interpretation is accurate. Structure built through repetition evaluates whether the interpretation is familiar. And familiar interpretations are always preferred, not because they are correct, but because they require less energy to activate. Tesla observed this in electrical systems long before he recognized it in mental systems. He noticed that current prefers established pathways, that once a route is created, the current will follow that route even if a more efficient route becomes available. And the preference is not intentional. The preference is structural. It is the result of resistance being lower in the established pathway than in the alternative pathway. And lower resistance is always preferred, not through decision, but through mechanics. The system follows the path of least resistance automatically. And automatic routing is not limited to electrical systems. Automatic routing is how all systems operate when structure is present, and structure is always present after repetition. Repetition creates the pathways. Pathways create the preference. Preference creates the perception that the familiar route is the correct route. But correctness is not what determines routing. Resistance is what determines routing. And resistance is determined by repetition. And repetition is determined by what the system was exposed to most often. And exposure is environmental, not internal. How often do you interpret new situations through patterns formed in situations that no longer exist? This is not a question of awareness. This is a question of structure. The patterns you formed in response to conditions that were present years ago continue to operate in conditions that are entirely different. And the patterns continue to operate not because they are accurate, but because they are established. Because the pathway was repeated enough times to become structural. And structural pathways do not require current conditions to justify their activation. Structural pathways activate automatically when any stimulus resembles the stimulus that created the pathway originally. And resemblance is not identity. Resemblance is partial match. And partial match is sufficient to trigger full activation. This is why perception is not accurate. Perception is pattern recognition. And pattern recognition does not evaluate whether the current situation matches the original situation completely. Pattern recognition evaluates whether the current situation contains enough elements to activate the existing pathway. And if enough elements are present, the pathway activates. And once activated, the pathway determines interpretation. And interpretation determines response. And response reinforces the pathway. And reinforced pathways become more established. And more established pathways activate more easily. And patterns that activate more easily feel more true. But truth is not what is being measured. Familiarity is what is being measured. The mind does not favor accuracy. The mind favors efficiency. And efficiency is achieved through automation. Through the conversion of conscious processes into automatic processes. Through the formation of pathways that execute without requiring awareness or effort. And automation is not optional. Automation is how the mind conserves energy. The mind cannot operate every process consciously. The mind does not have sufficient capacity. So the mind automates. And automation is achieved through repetition, through the repeated activation of the same pathway until the pathway becomes structural. And structural pathways do not degrade. Structural pathways persist. They persist even when the conditions that created them no longer exist. They persist even when the interpretations they produce are no longer accurate. They persist because persistence is structural, and structural persistence is not overcome through decision. Structural persistence is overcome through environmental change, through the removal of conditions that activate the pathway, through the introduction of conditions that prevent the pathway from completing. And prevention is not effort. Prevention is design. It is the deliberate arrangement of environment so that automatic pathways cannot execute. Fixed thought is not stubbornness. Fixed thought is the natural outcome of repetition sustained long enough to become structural. And structure does not change through realization. Structure does not change through understanding. Structure does not change through the recognition that the thought is inaccurate or unproductive. Structure changes through exposure to conditions that make the existing structure inefficient, that increase the resistance in the automatic pathway, that create interference that prevents the signal from completing its familiar route. And interference is not temporary disruption. Interference is sustained alteration of the environment in which the mind operates. An environment is not location. Environment is the set of stimuli the mind is exposed to, the inputs it receives, the patterns it encounters. and patterns encountered repeatedly become patterns internalized, and internalized patterns become structure, and structure becomes identity, and identity feels permanent. But identity is not permanent. Identity is the accumulated result of patterns repeated most often, and patterns can be changed by changing what is repeated, and what is repeated is determined by environment, and environment is controllable when thought is not. Tesla did not attempt to change his thoughts directly. He did not use willpower to suppress unwanted patterns. He did not use affirmation to replace automatic interpretations. He altered the conditions under which his mind operated. He controlled what he was exposed to. He controlled the rhythm of his routines. He controlled the duration and intensity of focus. And control of conditions is control of structure, because structure is formed by conditions, and conditions that are controlled produce structure that is intentional, and intentional structure is not the same as automatic structure. Automatic structure is formed unconsciously through exposure to uncontrolled conditions. Intentional structure is formed through exposure to conditions that are deliberately arranged, and deliberately arranged conditions produce deliberately formed pathways. And deliberately formed pathways do not operate randomly. They operate according to design, according to the repetition that was sustained under controlled conditions. And controlled conditions are what most people never establish. Most people allow their environment to remain random, allow their exposure to remain uncontrolled, allow their inputs to remain unexamined, and uncontrolled inputs produce uncontrolled structure, and uncontrolled structure produces uncontrolled thought, and uncontrolled thought is not freedom. Uncontrolled thought is automation without design. The condition of fixed thought is not permanent, but the condition of fixed thought does not resolve through insight. The condition resolves through environmental restructuring, through the systematic alteration of what the mind is exposed to, through the removal of stimuli that activate automatic pathways, through the introduction of patterns that create interference in existing routes. And interference is not negative. Interference is corrective. It is the prevention of automatic execution, the interruption of pathways that were formed unconsciously and now operate without evaluation. An interruption is not the same as suppression. Suppression is the attempt to stop a signal after it is already activated. Interruption is the prevention of activation in the first place, and prevention of activation is achieved through environmental control, through the recognition that the mind is not separate from the conditions it operates within, that the mind responds to structure, that structure is created through repetition, and repetition is determined by exposure, and exposure is controllable when conditions are controllable, and conditions become controllable when the relationship between environment and thought is understood not as belief but as mechanics. Once repetition creates structure, the structure operates automatically. The system does not require permission. The system does not evaluate whether the structure serves current conditions. The system simply executes. An execution is immediate. It is not delayed by consideration or choice. And immediacy is what makes automatic thought feel like truth. But automatic is not true. Automatic is established, and established pathways remain established until the conditions that sustain them are removed. The mind defaults to what has been repeated most often. What remains unexplained is why force, effort, and willpower fail to alter these pathways. Force applied to thought does not change thought. Force strengthens thought. This is not intuition. This is mechanics. When you attempt to suppress a pathway through effort, the effort itself activates the pathway. You cannot think about not thinking something without first thinking it. You cannot force yourself to stop interpreting a situation in a specific way without first activating the interpretation you are trying to prevent. And activation is not neutral. Activation is reinforcement. Every time a pathway is activated, the pathway becomes more established. The resistance decreases. The route becomes more automatic. And automaticity is what you are trying to eliminate. But elimination through force is elimination through activation. And activation is the opposite of elimination. This is why willpower fails. Willpower is sustained effort applied to suppression, and suppression requires continuous activation of the exact pathway being suppressed. And continuous activation is continuous strengthening, not weakening. Strengthening. And strengthened pathways do not fade. Strengthened pathways become more dominant. They activate more easily. They require less stimulus to trigger. And triggers that require less stimulus are triggers that operate constantly. Tesla observed that resistance in electrical systems is not overcome by increasing voltage. Increasing voltage, when resistance is high, produces heat. Heat is wasted energy, energy that does not convert to work. And work is movement. Voltage applied against high resistance does not produce movement. Voltage applied against high resistance produces heat and eventual failure of the system. The same principle applies to mental systems. Effort applied against established pathways does not weaken the pathways. Effort applied against established pathways produces friction, and friction is the experience most people describe as mental fatigue, as the sensation that thinking is exhausting. But thinking is not exhausting. Resistance is exhausting, and resistance is highest when force is applied against automatic structure, and automatic structure is not weakened by force. Automatic structure is designed to persist under pressure. Automatic structure was formed through repetition under varying conditions. It has already adapted to interference, and adapted systems do not yield to pressure. Adapted systems absorb pressure and continue operating. Willpower assumes that thought is voluntary, that the mind will obey instruction if the instruction is repeated with sufficient intensity. But thought is not voluntary. Thought is automatic, and automaticity does not respond to instruction. Automaticity responds to condition, to the environment in which the signal operates, to the presence or absence of the stimuli that trigger activation. And stimuli are not controlled through willpower. Stimuli are encountered or avoided. And avoidance is not suppression. Avoidance is environmental. It is the arrangement of conditions so that the trigger is not present, so that the pathway is not activated. And pathways that are not activated do not strengthen. They do not weaken immediately, but they do not strengthen. And non-strengthening is the first step toward degradation, because pathways that are not used lose priority. They remain structural, but they become less automatic. They require more stimulus to activate. They compete less effectively with other pathways. And competition between pathways is not conscious. Competition between pathways is determined by activation frequency, and activation frequency is determined by exposure, and exposure is environmental. Effort directed at changing thought produces the opposite effect, because effort is attention, and attention is activation. You cannot direct effort toward a thought without activating the neural pathway associated with that thought. And activation is signal transmission, and signal transmission is reinforcement. This is not theory, this is observable. People who try hardest to eliminate unwanted thoughts report the highest frequency of those thoughts, not despite the effort. Because of the effort creates a feedback loop. The thought appears. Effort is applied to suppress it. The suppression activates the thought. The activation produces the thought again. More effort is applied. More activation occurs, and the cycle repeats. And with each repetition, the pathway becomes more automatic. The thought appears more frequently. The effort required to suppress it increases. And increased effort produces increased activation. And increased activation produces increased automaticity. And increased automaticity is the opposite of elimination. This is why people who try to control their thoughts through willpower often report feeling controlled by their thoughts instead. They are not being controlled by their thoughts. They are strengthening their thoughts through the mechanism they believed would weaken them. Why does resistance produce the opposite of the intended effect? Because resistance is engagement. Engagement is activation. And activation is strengthening. The mind does not distinguish between positive engagement and negative engagement. The mind only registers that the pathway was used, that the signal was transmitted, that the route was traveled, and travel is what creates structure, not the reason for travel, not the intention behind travel, only the fact that travel occurred, and travel that occurs repeatedly creates pathways that are increasingly automatic, increasingly preferred, increasingly difficult to avoid, and avoidance through effort is not avoidance. Avoidance through effort is sustained engagement. It is the continuous activation of the exact pattern you are attempting to avoid, and continuous activation is continuous reinforcement, and reinforcement is not elimination. Reinforcement is establishment, and establishment is permanence, and permanence achieved through resistance is permanence that feels involuntary, that feels like something happening to you rather than something you are doing. But it is not involuntary, it is structural, and structure was created through the exact mechanism intended to prevent it. Emotional pressure produces the same failure. Emotional pressure is intensity applied to thought, and intensity is amplification. Amplification does not change the content of the signal. Amplification increases the strength of the signal, and increased signal strength is increased pathway activation, and increased activation is increased structure. This is why anxiety about unwanted thoughts produces more unwanted thoughts. The anxiety is emotional amplification. The amplification strengthens the signal. The strengthened signal activates more frequently. The increased frequency produces more anxiety, and the cycle compounds. Not because the thought is powerful, because the mechanism of resistance is creating the condition it is attempting to prevent. And condition created through resistance is condition that persists, that feels permanent, that feels uncontrollable. But uncontrollable is not accurate. Uncontrollable is the experience of trying to control structure through mechanisms that strengthen structure. And strengthened structure is not eliminated through more of the same mechanism. Strengthened structure is eliminated through withdrawal, through the removal of activation, through the cessation of engagement. And cessation is not suppression. Cessation is environmental. It is the arrangement of conditions so that the pathway is not triggered, so that the signal is not transmitted, so that the route is not traveled. Tesla did not fight unwanted patterns of thought. He withdrew the conditions that sustained them. He did not use effort to suppress. He used environmental control to prevent activation. And prevention is not the same as suppression. Suppression is active. Prevention is passive. Suppression requires continuous attention. Prevention requires initial design followed by maintenance, and maintenance is not effort. Maintenance is observation. It is the monitoring of conditions to ensure that triggers remain absent, that stimuli remain controlled, that the environment continues to support the structure you want rather than the structure you are eliminating. And elimination through non-activation is slower than people prefer. But elimination through non-activation is permanent, because pathways that are not activated do not strengthen, and pathways that do not strengthen gradually lose priority. They remain present but become less automatic. They require more stimulus to activate, and stimulus that is controlled is stimulus that can be kept below the threshold required for activation. And activation that does not occur is reinforcement that does not happen, and reinforcement that does not happen is structure that does not strengthen. And structure that does not strengthen is structure that eventually degrades. Force fails because force is the application of energy against resistance. And resistance in neural pathways is not physical resistance. Resistance in neural pathways is activation threshold, the amount of stimulus required to trigger the pathway, and lowered activation threshold is what makes pathways automatic. And automatic pathways are not eliminated by applying force. Automatic pathways are eliminated by raising activation threshold, by making the pathway harder to trigger, and harder to trigger is achieved through non-use, through the withdrawal of the stimuli that activate the pathway, through the prevention of the conditions that lower threshold. And conditions that lower threshold are conditions of repeated activation, and repeated activation is what force produces. Force is sustained attention. Sustained attention is repeated activation. Repeated activation is lowered threshold, and lowered threshold is increased automaticity, and increased automaticity is the opposite of elimination. This is the mechanical reality of why effort fails, not because effort is insufficient, because effort is the wrong mechanism. Effort is engagement, and engagement strengthens, and strengthening is not weakening, and weakening is what elimination requires. How much of your mental energy is consumed by trying not to think thoughts that only exist because you are trying not to think them? This is not a question of discipline. This is a question of understanding mechanism. The thoughts you resist most strongly are often the thoughts that are most automatic. Not because the thoughts are powerful, but because resistance has made them powerful. Because every instance of resistance was an instance of activation. And accumulated activation is established structure. And established structure is automatic execution. And automatic execution is not controlled through more resistance. Automatic execution is reduced through withdrawal, through the cessation of the resistance that is strengthening the pattern. And cessation of resistance is not surrender to the thought. Cessation of resistance is recognition that resistance is the mechanism creating the problem. And recognition does not require belief. Recognition requires observation. Observation that effort produces frequency, that resistance produces automaticity, that force produces the opposite of the intended effect. And observation that is honest is observation that leads to different action, not more of the same action applied with greater intensity. Different action. Action that is environmental rather than mental. Action that controls stimulus rather than response. Action that prevents activation rather than attempting to suppress activation after it has already occurred. Force assumes that the mind is oppositional, that it requires pressure to change, but the mind is not oppositional. That it requires pressure to change, but the mind is not oppositional. The mind is responsive, and response is automatic. The mind responds to condition, to environment, to the structure of stimulus and signal. And structure is not changed through opposition. Structure is changed through alteration of the conditions that create structure. And conditions are not internal. Conditions are external. They are what the mind encounters, what the mind is exposed to, what the mind processes repeatedly until processing becomes automatic. And automatic processing is not changed through instruction. Automatic processing is changed through environmental redesign, through the systematic alteration of what is encountered, what is processed, what is repeated, and repetition under new conditions creates new structure, and new structure creates new automaticity. And new automaticity is not created through force applied to old automaticity. New automaticity is created through environmental conditions that favor new pathways over old pathways, that make new routes easier to travel than old routes, that lower resistance in desired patterns and maintain resistance in undesired patterns. And maintain resistance in undesired patterns is achieved through non-activation, through the prevention of the triggers that activate those patterns. And prevention is environmental, not mental. The failure of force is not evidence that change is impossible. The failure of force is evidence that force is the wrong tool. That effort directed at suppression is effort applied to the mechanism that strengthens what is being suppressed. And strengthening through suppression is why most people experience their thoughts as involuntary, as automatic, as beyond control. But beyond control is not accurate. Beyond control through force is accurate. And beyond control through force leaves one option: control through environment. Control through the arrangement of conditions that prevent unwanted activation and encourage desired activation. And encouragement is not effort. Encouragement is the lowering of resistance through repeated use of desired pathways under controlled conditions. And controlled conditions are conditions where unwanted pathways are not triggered, where attention is directed not toward suppressing old patterns but toward activating new patterns. And activation of new patterns is not effort, when the environment supports activation, when the stimuli are present, when the triggers are designed, when the structure of the day allows repetition without requiring willpower. And willpower is not required when environment is designed. Willpower is only required when environment opposes desired action. And opposed action is action that does not persist. And persistence is what creates structure. And structure is what changes thought. Force fails because thought is not controlled. Thought is automatic, and automaticity is not overcome through opposition. Automaticity is overcome through the creation of alternative automaticity. through the formation of pathways that activate more easily than the pathways being eliminated. And pathways activate more easily when they are used more often. And use is not effort, use is exposure. Exposure to the conditions that trigger the desired pathway. Exposure repeated until the pathway becomes structural, until activation becomes automatic, until the new pattern executes without requiring decision. And decision is not required when structure is established. Decision is only required when structure is absent, and absent structure is what exists before repetition, and repetition is what creates structure, and structure is what eliminates the need for willpower, because willpower is the mechanism used when automaticity opposes desired outcome, and automaticity that opposes desired outcome is automaticity formed under conditions that were not controlled. And conditions that were not controlled produce structure that was not designed, and structure that was not designed does not serve intent, it serves repetition, and repetition without intent is automatic execution of patterns formed through exposure to uncontrolled environment. Force, when applied to establish structure, does not weaken the structure. Force activates the structure. Activation reinforces the structure. Reinforcement establishes the structure more deeply. And deeply established structures do not yield to pressure. They persist under pressure. They were formed through repetition under varying conditions. They have adapted to interference, and adaptation to interference is what makes them automatic. And automatic structures are not eliminated through force. They are eliminated through obsolescence, through the formation of competing structures that are more automatic, that activate more easily, that require less stimulus to trigger. And less stimulus means more frequent activation, and more frequent activation means stronger structure. And stronger structure eventually dominates weaker structure. Not through conflict, through preference, through the natural tendency of the system to route signals along paths of least resistance. And least resistance is most recent structure, most repeated structure, most automatic structure. The mind strengthens what it resists. What remains is how Tesla recognized the mind as a system that rewires itself when exposed to specific conditions rather than specific efforts. Tesla observed systems, not just electrical systems, all systems. He noticed that current flowing through a conductor created pathways. That repeated flow along the same pathway reduced resistance. That resistance reduced meant the pathway became preferred. And preference was not decision. Preference was mechanics. The system routed current along the path that required the least energy. And least energy was always the path that had been traveled most often. He observed this in circuits. He observed this in motors. He observed this in transformers. And he observed this in his own thinking. The mind he recognized was not exempt from the principles governing electrical systems. The mind was an electrical system. It operated through signal transmission, through pathways that formed through repetition, through structures that became automatic when conditions were consistent. And consistency was not belief. Consistency was exposure. Exposure to the same stimulus under the same conditions, until the response became structural, until the pathway became permanent, until activation became automatic. And automatic activation was not consciousness. Automatic activation was efficiency. It was the system adapting to reduce the energy required to perform repeated functions. He noticed that his thoughts followed patterns, that the same interpretations appeared in response to specific triggers, that the interpretations were not evaluated, they were executed, and execution without evaluation was evidence of structure, evidence that the pathway had been established through repetition, that the signal no longer required conscious direction, that the route was automatic, and automaticity, he observed, was not limited to simple responses. Automaticity extended to complex interpretation, to multi-step reasoning, to conclusions that appeared instantaneous but were actually the execution of pathways formed through thousands of prior activations. And prior activations were not remembered. They were structural. They existed as reduced resistance in specific neural routes. and reduced resistance was what made certain thoughts appear more readily than others. Not because those thoughts were more accurate, because those thoughts were more automatic, and automatic thoughts felt true because they required no effort to produce. They simply appeared, and appearance without effort was interpreted as naturalness, as correctness, as the obvious way to think. But obvious was not true. Obvious was established. Tesla observed that rhythm governed stability in electrical systems, that alternating current required precise timing to function efficiently, that timing inconsistencies produced interference, that interference produced heat, that heat was wasted energy, and wasted energy was reduced capacity. He applied the same observation to mental function. He noticed that thought operating without rhythm produced the same result. Scattered attention produced interference. Interference produced mental fatigue. And mental fatigue was not tiredness. Mental fatigue was evidence of inefficiency, of energy expended without corresponding output, of signals transmitted along routes that competed rather than cooperated. And competition between pathways was what occurred when rhythm was absent, when activation was random, when the system could not predict which pathway would be required and therefore could not optimize for any pathway. And optimization required prediction, and prediction required pattern, and pattern required rhythm. Rhythm was the repetition of activation at consistent intervals, and consistent intervals allowed the system to allocate resources efficiently, to prepare pathways before signals arrived, to reduce resistance in routes that would be traveled at predictable times. He structured his days with precision, not because structure was comfortable, because structure was efficient. He woke at the same time. He worked in the same intervals. He ate at the same hours. He walked the same routes. And the repetition was not ritual. The repetition was environmental design. It was the creation of conditions that allowed his mind to operate without wasting energy on decisions that did not require thought. Decisions about when to wake did not require thought. Decisions about when to work did not require thought. Decisions about when to rest did not require thought. These decisions were structural. They were made once through design and then executed automatically through rhythm. And rhythm eliminated decision fatigue, eliminated the depletion that occurs when the mind is required to evaluate every action. And evaluation of every action is what occurs when structure is absent, when environment is random, when conditions vary unpredictably, and unpredictable conditions produce unpredictable responses, and unpredictable responses prevent the formation of automatic pathways, and pathways that are not automatic require conscious effort, and conscious effort is limited, and limited resource depletes, and depleted resource is what most people describe as exhaustion. Load was another principle he observed in both electrical and mental systems. Load is the demand placed on the system, and demand that exceeds capacity produces failure. Not moral failure, mechanical failure. The system cannot process the input, cannot transmit the signal, cannot maintain function, and function that cannot be maintained degrades. It does not degrade gracefully, it degrades catastrophically, because systems do not fail incrementally under overload. Systems fail suddenly. They operate at capacity until capacity is exceeded, and then they cease to operate entirely. Tesla observed this in circuits, and he observed this in minds. He noticed that continuous operation without rest produced not gradual decline, but sudden collapse, that the mind could function under high load for extended duration and then lose all capacity without warning. And loss of capacity was not recoverable through continued effort. Loss of capacity was recoverable only through rest, through the cessation of signal transmission, through the period where pathways were not activated and resistance could reset, and reset was not optional, reset was mandatory. Systems that did not reset did not recover. They operated at reduced capacity permanently, or they failed completely. Rest, he observed, was not the absence of activity. Rest was the absence of load, and load was not work. Load was demand, and demand could be present even when work was not. The mind could be loaded through attention, through exposure to stimulus that required processing, through the presence of unresolved patterns that continued to activate pathways even when conscious focus was directed elsewhere, and pathways that continued to activate during rest were pathways that prevented rest from occurring. This is why most people do not experience rest even when activity ceases. Because activity ceased but load did not. Load remained because the environment continued to present stimuli, continued to trigger pathways, continued to demand processing, and processing that continues during rest is processing that prevents the reset. Rest is meant to provide. Tesla controlled this through environmental design. He eliminated stimuli that were not necessary. He reduced load by reducing exposure. He created periods where the environment contained no triggers, where pathways were not activated, where signals were not transmitted, and transmission that did not occur was resistance that could reset, and reset resistance was recovered capacity, and recovered capacity was what allowed sustained function without degradation. He did not separate mental systems from electrical systems, because he observed no distinction at the level of principle. Both systems transmitted signals. Both systems formed pathways through repetition. Both systems preferred routes of least resistance. Both systems failed under excessive load. Both systems required rhythm to operate efficiently. Both systems degraded when rest was insufficient, and degradation in both systems was not reversible through effort. Degradation was reversible through environmental correction, through the restoration of conditions that allowed the system to reset, to recover, to rebuild capacity that had been depleted through operation beyond sustainable limits. And sustainable limits were not arbitrary. Sustainable limits were structural. They were determined by the capacity of the system and the load placed on the system. And capacity was not increased through willpower. Capacity was increased through training, through the gradual exposure to increasing load under controlled conditions. And controlled conditions were conditions where rest was sufficient, where rhythm was maintained, where overload was prevented. And prevention of overload was not weakness. Prevention of overload was the only strategy that allowed long-term function. Tesla observed his own patterns with the same precision he applied to his machines. He noticed which thoughts appeared under which conditions. He noticed which interpretations activated automatically. He noticed which conclusions required no evidence because the pathway was so established that evidence was irrelevant. And evidence being irrelevant was not rationality. Evidence being irrelevant was automaticity. It was the execution of structure without evaluation, and structure without evaluation was not consciousness. Structure without evaluation was mechanical operation. It was the mind functioning as system, responding to stimulus according to pathways that had been formed through prior repetition. And prior repetition was not remembered. Prior repetition was structural. It existed as physical organization of neural tissue, as reduced resistance in specific routes, as preference for specific interpretations. And preference that was not chosen was preference that was structural. And structural preference was not changed through realization. Structural preference was changed through the formation of competing structures, through the repetition of alternative pathways under controlled conditions, until the alternative pathways became more automatic than the original pathways. How often do you notice that your response to a situation preceded your evaluation of the situation? This is not a question of speed. This is a question of sequence. The interpretation appears before analysis occurs. The conclusion forms before evidence is examined. The response activates before the stimulus is fully processed. And activation before processing is evidence of automaticity. Evidence that the pathway was triggered by partial match, that full evaluation was not required because the structure was established, that the mind executed pattern rather than analyzing input, and execution of pattern is what occurs when pathways are automatic, when resistance is low, when the route has been traveled so many times that the signal completes the route before conscious awareness registers that transmission has begun. And transmission that completes before awareness is transmission that cannot be controlled through decision, because decision occurs after awareness, and awareness occurs after transmission is already complete. This is the sequence. This is why willpower fails. Willpower operates at the level of decision, but automatic pathways operate before decision is possible. They activate, transmit, and complete before the conscious mind recognizes that activation has occurred, and completion before recognition is why automatic thoughts feel involuntary. They are not involuntary. They are faster than conscious processing, and speed that exceeds conscious processing is speed that appears instant, and instant appearance is interpreted as truth, but instant is not true. Instant is automatic. Tesla recognized that the mind rewired itself continuously. That rewiring was not event. Rewiring was process. It occurred with every signal transmission, with every pathway activation, with every repetition. And repetition was not neutral. Repetition was formative. It either strengthened existing structure or created new structure. And existing structure was strengthened unless conditions prevented activation, unless environment was controlled, so that triggers were absent, so that pathways were not used. And pathways that were not used did not strengthen. They did not weaken immediately, but they did not strengthen. And non-strengthening was the first stage of degradation, because pathways competed, and competition was determined by activation frequency. And activation frequency was determined by environment, by what the mind was exposed to, by what stimuli were present, by what triggers were encountered. And triggers encountered repeatedly produced pathways activated repeatedly. And pathways activated repeatedly became pathways that were automatic. And automatic pathways dominated pathways that were not automatic, not through superiority, through efficiency, through the fact that automatic pathways required less energy and therefore were preferred by a system designed to conserve energy. The technique, he observed, was not action. The technique was condition. It was the arrangement of environment, so that desired pathways were activated repeatedly under rhythm, so that undesired pathways were not activated, so that load was controlled, so that rest was sufficient, so that the system could rewire itself, not through force, but through exposure, through the natural tendency of the system to form structure around repeated patterns. And repeated patterns were not chosen through willpower. Repeated patterns were environmental. They were the patterns the environment contained, the patterns the environment triggered, the patterns the environment sustained through consistent stimulation. And consistent stimulation was what created structure, not belief, not intention, stimulation. And stimulation was external. It was what the mind encountered, and what the mind encountered was controllable. And controllable environment was controllable rewiring, not immediate rewiring, gradual rewiring. Rewiring through repetition sustained long enough for structure to form, for pathways to establish, for automation to replace effort. And automation that replaced effort was automation that persisted, because persistence did not require willpower. Persistence required only that conditions remain stable, that environment continue to support the structure, that triggers remain consistent, that rhythm be maintained. Once the system is understood as electrical, the question is no longer how to change the mind through effort, but how to change the conditions under which the mind operates. And conditions are not internal. Conditions are external. They are environmental. And environment is structural. And structure, when designed, produces designed outcomes, not through force applied to thought, through exposure repeated until structure forms automatically. The mind is a system that responds to structure, not instruction. What remains is the specific condition that forces reorganization rather than simply adding new pathways alongside old ones. The technique is not an action. The technique is a condition where the old structure cannot function and the new structure must form or the system fails. This is not motivation. This is mechanics. Tesla observed that systems reorganize when continuation in the current configuration becomes more costly than reorganization. When the energy required to maintain existing pathways exceeds the energy required to form new pathways. And energy expenditure is not conscious. Energy expenditure is automatic. The system routes signals along paths of least resistance. and least resistance is determined by current structure. But current structure is only maintained when activation continues, when pathways are used, when signals are transmitted along established routes, and transmission along established routes is what keeps those routes as the paths of least resistance. But transmission stops when the environment no longer contains the triggers that activate those routes, and triggers that are absent cannot activate pathways, and pathways that are not activated begin to accumulate resistance. And accumulated resistance means the pathway is no longer the path of least resistance. And when it is no longer the path of least resistance, the system stops preferring it, not through decision, through efficiency. Reorganization occurs when the environment makes the old structure inefficient and the new structure necessary, not desirable. Necessary. Necessary means the system cannot function without it, cannot achieve baseline operation, cannot maintain stability, and instability forces adaptation, not gradual adaptation, immediate adaptation. Because systems under stress do not have capacity for gradual change. Systems under stress adapt or collapse, and collapse is not chosen. Collapse is what happens when adaptation does not occur quickly enough. Tesla understood this. He observed that his mind reorganized most rapidly, not when he tried to think differently, but when he created conditions where thinking in the old pattern was impossible, where the old pattern could not execute because the environmental support for that pattern was absent, and absent support meant the pattern could not complete, and patterns that could not complete did not strengthen, and patterns that did not strengthen lost priority, and lost priority meant the system stopped routing signals through those pathways, not because the pathways were eliminated, but because they were no longer efficient, and efficiency is what determines routing, always, without exception. The condition requires three elements operating simultaneously. First, the complete withdrawal of environmental triggers that activate unwanted pathways. Not reduction, withdrawal. Reduction allows occasional activation, and occasional activation is sufficient to maintain structure. Structure does not require constant activation. Structure requires only that activation occur frequently enough to prevent significant resistance accumulation, and frequency sufficient to prevent resistance accumulation is higher than most people realize. A pathway activated once per week maintains sufficient structure to remain automatic, so reduction to weekly activation is not elimination. Reduction to weekly activation is maintenance, and maintenance of unwanted structure is not reorganization. Maintenance is continuation. The triggers must be withdrawn completely, not temporarily, completely. And completely means the environment is redesigned so that the triggers cannot appear. Not that they are resisted when they appear, that they cannot appear, and cannot means structural impossibility. The design of the environment makes the presence of the trigger impossible, not difficult, impossible. And impossibility is not effort. Impossibility is design. Second, the sustained exposure to patterns that activate the desired structure. Not occasional exposure. Sustained exposure. Sustained means the pattern is present consistently, that the trigger for the desired pathway appears at predictable intervals, that the rhythm is maintained without interruption, and rhythm without interruption is what creates new automaticity. Because automaticity is formed through repetition, and repetition is only effective when rhythm is consistent, when the interval between activations is predictable, when the system can anticipate the next activation and prepare the pathway in advance. And preparation in advance is what reduces resistance, what makes the pathway easier to activate, what causes the system to prefer the new route over routes that are not prepared. And preparation occurs only when rhythm is consistent. When the pattern repeats at intervals the system can predict, and prediction is what allows optimization, and optimization is what makes new pathways automatic, not through force, through frequency, through exposure repeated at consistent intervals until the structure forms, until the resistance decreases, until the pathway becomes the path of least resistance, and path of least resistance is the path the system prefers, not through decision, through mechanics. Third, the elimination of decision. Decision is what depletes willpower. and willpower is limited, and limited resource depletes quickly when demand is constant. The condition must be designed so that the desired pathway activates automatically, so that no decision is required, so that the environment triggers the pattern without requiring conscious choice. And choice eliminated is energy conserved, and conserved energy is capacity available, and available capacity is what allows sustained function, what allows the new pattern to repeat long enough to become structural, because structural formation requires thousands of repetitions, and thousands of repetitions cannot be sustained through willpower. Thousands of repetitions can only be sustained through environmental design, through the arrangement of conditions so that the desired pattern is triggered automatically, so that activation does not require decision, so that the pathway is used not because it is chosen but because the environment makes it the only available route. And only available route is not restriction. Only available route is precision. It is the recognition that attention is limited, that the mind cannot maintain multiple competing patterns simultaneously, that competition between patterns produces interference, and interference produces inefficiency, and inefficiency is what prevents structure formation. So the environment is designed to eliminate competition, to provide only the stimulus that activates the desired pathway, to remove all stimuli that activate competing pathways. And removal is not deprivation. Removal is focus. It is the concentration of environmental input so that structure forms in the desired pattern rather than scattering across multiple patterns that interfere with each other. How much of your environment still contains the triggers that activate the patterns you claim to want eliminated? This is not a question of awareness. This is a question of design. If the triggers remain present, the patterns remain active. If the patterns remain active, the structure remains established. If the structure remains established, the pathways remain automatic. And automatic pathways are not eliminated through occasional decisions to avoid activation. Automatic pathways are eliminated through environmental conditions that make activation impossible. And impossibility is not achieved through scattered effort. Impossibility is achieved through systematic redesign, through the examination of every element of the environment, and the removal of every element that serves as trigger, not reduction of exposure, removal of presence. And removal of presence requires that the environment be controlled, that inputs be filtered, that stimuli be selected. And selection is not restriction, selection is precision. It is the recognition that the mind forms structure around whatever it is exposed to most frequently, and most frequently is determined by environment, and environment is either controlled or random, and random environment produces random structure, and random structure produces random thought, and random thought is not freedom. Random thought is the automatic execution of patterns formed unconsciously through exposure to uncontrolled conditions. The condition is not comfortable. The condition is precise. Precision requires that variables be controlled, that rhythm be maintained, that load be managed, that rest be sufficient. And sufficient rest is not determined by feeling rested. Sufficient rest is determined by capacity recovered, by the ability to function at baseline without degradation. And baseline is not peak performance. Baseline is sustainable operation. Operation that can continue indefinitely without producing progressive decline. And progressive decline is what occurs when rest is insufficient, when load exceeds capacity for extended duration, when the system operates in deficit, and deficit operation is not sustainable. Deficit operation is temporary. It is function maintained through depletion of reserves, and reserves are finite, and finite reserves deplete, and depleted reserves produce collapse. And collapse is forced rest. It is rest that occurs not through design but through incapacity, through the system's inability to continue functioning, and incapacity is not recovered quickly. Incapacity requires extended rest, rest that is longer than the period of deficit operation, and extended rest is what most people never allow. Most people operate in continuous deficit. They deplete reserves. They experience collapse. They rest minimally. And minimal rest does not restore reserves. Minimal rest prevents further decline temporarily, and temporary prevention is not recovery. Temporary prevention is delay. It delays total collapse but does not restore capacity. and capacity not restored is capacity permanently reduced. Tesla designed conditions where his mind could not function in old patterns, where the old patterns were structurally impossible because the environmental support was absent. And absence was not temporary avoidance. Absence was permanent removal. He did not keep objects that triggered old patterns and attempt to resist the patterns when triggered. He removed the objects. He did not maintain routines that activated old pathways and attempt to override the activation through willpower. He changed the routines. He did not expose himself to stimuli that reinforced old interpretations and attempt to reinterpret consciously. He eliminated the stimuli, and elimination was not suppression. Elimination was environmental. It was the systematic removal of every element that served as trigger for patterns he intended to eliminate. An elimination of triggers is elimination of activation. An elimination of activation is elimination of reinforcement. An elimination of reinforcement is the beginning of degradation, not immediate degradation. Gradual degradation. Degradation that occurs because the pathway is not used, and pathways not used accumulate resistance. And accumulated resistance means the pathway is no longer automatic. It requires more stimulus to activate. It competes less effectively with other pathways. And competition is what determines which pattern executes when multiple patterns are available. And multiple patterns are always available. The mind does not contain single pathways. The mind contains networks of competing pathways. And competition is determined by resistance. And resistance is determined by frequency of use. And frequency of use is determined by environment. The condition creates forced obsolescence. It makes the old structure obsolete, not through direct attack, but through environmental change that makes the old structure non-functional, and non-functional structure is not maintained. The system does not maintain pathways that do not function. The system maintains pathways that are used, and use is determined by environment, and environment is either designed or random, and random environment maintains random structure, and random structure is the structure formed through historical exposure, through patterns encountered in the past under conditions that may no longer exist, and structure formed in the past does not serve present function unless present conditions match past conditions, and present conditions rarely match past conditions. Conditions evolve, and evolved conditions require evolved structure, and evolved structure is not created through effort applied to old structure. Evolved structure is created through environmental conditions that make old structure obsolete and new structure necessary. And necessity is not motivation. Necessity is structural requirement. It is the recognition that the system cannot achieve baseline function without the new structure. That old structure produces failure. That failure is immediate. That immediate failure forces adaptation. And forced adaptation is adaptation that occurs rapidly, not gradually. Rapidly, because the system is under stress, and systems under stress adapt or collapse, and collapse is not acceptable, so adaptation occurs, not through willpower, through necessity. The technique is the creation of environmental conditions where old pathways cannot activate, new pathways must activate, and the system has no option except reorganization, not reorganization attempted through effort. Reorganization forced through condition, through the recognition that systems rewire themselves when the environment demands it, when continuation in current configuration is more costly than reorganization, when the energy required to maintain old structure exceeds the energy required to form new structure, and energy comparison is automatic. The system does not evaluate consciously. The system routes signals along paths of least resistance, and least resistance is determined by current structure and current environment. And when environment changes, resistance changes. And changed resistance changes routing. And changed routing changes structure. And changed structure changes thought. Not through belief, through mechanics, through the automatic operation of a system that responds to condition rather than instruction, that reorganizes when forced, that adapts when necessary, that forms new pathways when old pathways cannot function. And old pathways that cannot function are old pathways that the environment no longer supports. And support withdrawn is structure degraded. and structure degraded is structure replaced, not through choice, through necessity. The condition does not ask the mind to change. The condition makes continuation in the current configuration impossible. And impossibility is not resistance. Impossibility is structural fact. And structural fact is not overcome through effort. Structural fact is adapted to. And adaptation is automatic when the alternative is failure. And failure is what occurs when old structure persists in an environment that no longer supports it. An environment that does not support old structure is an environment that has been designed not to support old structure. Not by accident, by precision, by systematic removal of every trigger, by sustained exposure to new patterns, by elimination of decision through automaticity. And automaticity achieved through environmental design is automaticity that persists, that does not require maintenance through willpower, that operates continuously because the environment continuously supports it. The mind reorganizes not when it is convinced, but when the environment changes. And environment is controllable. And controlled environment is controlled structure. And controlled structure is controlled thought. Not through force applied to thought, through conditions arranged so that thought forms automatically in the desired pattern. Through the recognition that rewiring is not action. Rewiring is response. Response to condition. Response that is automatic. Response that occurs whether chosen or not. Because the system adapts, and adaptation is not optional. Adaptation is mechanical, and mechanical processes do not require belief. They require only condition, and condition is what the technique creates. The mind reorganizes when continuation becomes more costly than adaptation. What remains is the observation of how this reorganization manifests, how perception changes when structure changes, how thought operates differently when pathways have been replaced rather than resisted. Perception is not observation of reality. Perception is the routing of signal through existing structure. The signal enters, the structure determines which pathways activate. The activated pathways determine interpretation, and interpretation is what consciousness experiences as perception. But consciousness does not perceive the signal. Consciousness perceives the interpretation produced by the pathways the signal activated, and the pathways activated are determined by structure, by which routes have the lowest resistance, by which patterns have been established through prior repetition, and prior repetition is not remembered. Prior repetition exists as physical organization, as the configuration of neural tissue, as the specific pathways that activate automatically when certain signals are received. And automatic activation means perception is not choice. Perception is output. Output produced by structure processing input. And output changes only when structure changes, not when belief changes, not when intention changes, when structure changes. And structure changes when the conditions that formed the structure are replaced by conditions that form different structure. Tesla observed that circuits interpret voltage based on their configuration. The same voltage applied to different configurations produces different outputs, not because the voltage changed, because the structure processing the voltage changed. And structure determines output, always. A resistor reduces voltage, a capacitor stores voltage, a transformer alters voltage. The voltage itself is unchanged, but the output differs based on which component processes the signal. The mind operates identically. The same stimulus applied to different neural structures produces different perceptions, not because the stimulus changed, because the structure processing the stimulus changed. And changed structure produces changed output automatically, not through effort, through mechanics. The signal is routed through the available pathways. The available pathways are determined by resistance, and resistance is determined by repetition, and repetition is determined by environment, and environment determines which pathways form, and formed pathways determine perception. Not perception as effort, perception as automatic output of structure processing input. When structure changes, perception changes immediately, not gradually, immediately, because perception is not belief. Perception is routing, and routing is determined by resistance, and resistance is structural. When new pathways are formed through sustained repetition under controlled conditions, those pathways have lower resistance than pathways that were not used during the same period. And lower resistance means signals route through the new pathways preferentially, not through decision, through efficiency. The system always routes signals along paths of least resistance, and least resistance is the pathway used most recently under current conditions. And current conditions are the conditions created through environmental design, through the systematic activation of desired pathways and the prevention of activation of undesired pathways. And prevention sustained long enough causes undesired pathways to accumulate resistance. And accumulated resistance means those pathways are no longer preferred, not because they were eliminated, because they became less efficient than the alternative pathways. And less efficient pathways are not selected when more efficient pathways are available. And availability is structural, and structure is environmental, and environment is controlled. Feedback loops are what stabilize new perception. A feedback loop is signal output that becomes signal input. The pathway activates. The activation produces interpretation. The interpretation produces behavior. The behavior produces result. The result is observed. The observation is signal. The signal activates the pathway again, and repeated activation through feedback strengthens the pathway. This is not circular reasoning. This is signal amplification through iteration. Each cycle through the loop reduces resistance slightly, and reduced resistance means the next signal routes through the same pathway more easily. And easier routing means more frequent activation, and more frequent activation means further reduction in resistance. And the cycle continues, not infinitely, until the pathway becomes the path of least resistance for that category of signal. And once it becomes the path of least resistance, the pathway activates automatically, without requiring the feedback loop to strengthen it further. The structure is established, the perception is automatic, and automatic perception is not questioned. Automatic perception feels like observation of reality, but it is not observation of reality. It is interpretation produced by structure, and structure was formed through environmental conditions that sustain the feedback loop long enough for the pathway to stabilize. Oscillation occurs when two pathways compete, when signal could route through pathway A or pathway B, when both pathways have similar resistance, when neither pathway dominates, and neither dominating means the signal alternates. It routes through pathway A, then pathway B, then pathway A again, and alternation is experienced as uncertainty, as the inability to settle on a single interpretation, as the sense that perception is unstable, and unstable perception is accurate description. The structure is unstable. Neither pathway has sufficient advantage to become the preferred route, and preferred route is what produces stable perception. Stable perception is perception that does not oscillate, that routes through the same pathway consistently, that produces the same interpretation reliably, and reliability is what allows the system to operate efficiently. Oscillation prevents efficiency. Oscillation consumes energy, because the signal must traverse two pathways instead of one, and traversing two pathways uses twice the energy, and doubled energy consumption is not sustainable. So the system resolves oscillation, not through conscious decision, through feedback, through the process where one pathway is used slightly more often, and slightly more often means slightly lower resistance, and slightly lower resistance means slightly higher probability of activation, and slightly higher probability means the pathway is used more often in subsequent cycles, and more often in subsequent cycles means resistance decreases further, and decreased resistance means increased probability, and the cycle continues until one pathway becomes dominant, until oscillation ceases, until perception stabilizes, and stabilization is automatic. It is the natural resolution of competing pathways through the process of use reducing resistance. How often does your interpretation of a situation shift between two opposing views without settling? This is not indecision. This is structural oscillation. Two pathways have been established through prior repetition. Both pathways have sufficient strength to activate. Neither pathway has sufficient dominance to prevent the other from activating, and neither preventing the other means the signal alternates between them. And alternation is experienced as confusion, as the inability to know which interpretation is correct. But correctness is not what is being measured. Correctness is not structural, efficiency is structural, and efficiency is determined by resistance, and resistance is equal in both pathways. So the system oscillates, and oscillation continues until environmental conditions favor one pathway over the other, until one pathway is activated more frequently, until frequency of activation reduces resistance sufficiently that the pathway becomes preferred, and preferred pathway is the pathway that activates automatically, and automatic activation is stable perception, perception that does not shift, that does not alternate, that produces consistent interpretation, and consistent interpretation is what the system requires for efficient operation, not correct interpretation. Consistent interpretation. Signal routing changes when pathway resistance changes, and pathway resistance changes continuously based on use. Pathways used recently have lower resistance than pathways not used recently. This is not permanent. This is dynamic. Resistance increases when pathways are not used. Resistance decreases when pathways are used. And the rate of change is determined by the magnitude of change in environmental conditions. Small environmental changes produce small changes in resistance. Large environmental changes produce large changes in resistance. And large changes in resistance produce large changes in routing. And large changes in routing produce large changes in perception. This is why environmental redesign produces rapid perceptual change, not because the mind decided to perceive differently, because the pathways that determine perception changed resistance rapidly due to large changes in activation patterns. And activation patterns are determined by environment, and environment was redesigned, and redesigned environment activated different pathways. And different pathways activated repeatedly reduced resistance in those pathways, and reduced resistance in new pathways combined with increased resistance in old pathways produced routing change, and routing change produced perceptual change, automatically, without effort, without decision, as mechanical consequence of structural change. Perception after reorganization does not feel like new perception. Perception after reorganization feels like accurate perception, like seeing clearly for the first time, like previous perception was distortion and current perception is truth. But current perception is not truth. Current perception is output of current structure, and current structure was formed through recent environmental conditions, and recent environmental conditions were designed, were controlled, were arranged to activate specific pathways and prevent activation of other pathways. And the design succeeded. The structure changed, the perception changed. And changed perception feels true because automatic perception always feels true. Because perception that requires no effort to produce is perceived as natural, as obvious, as the way things actually are. But the way things actually are is not what is being perceived. The way signals are currently being routed is what is being perceived. And current routing is determined by current structure, and current structure was formed through controlled conditions, through environmental design, through sustained activation of desired pathways, until those pathways became automatic. And automatic pathways produce automatic perception, and automatic perception is not questioned. Automatic perception is experienced as reality. The shift is not gradual once the threshold is crossed. The threshold is the point where new pathway resistance drops below old pathway resistance. Before the threshold, old pathways dominate. Signals route through old pathways. Old interpretations appear automatically. Old perception persists. At the threshold, resistance equalizes. Oscillation occurs. Neither pathway dominates. Perception becomes unstable. Interpretation shifts between old pattern and new pattern. And shifting is experienced as uncertainty, as transition, as the period where neither perception feels stable. Past the threshold, new pathways dominate. Signals route through new pathways. new interpretations appear automatically, new perception stabilizes, and stabilization past the threshold is rapid, not gradual. Rapid, because once new pathways become preferred, every subsequent signal that routes through them reduces resistance further, and reduced resistance increases preference. An increased preference increases frequency of activation, and increased frequency reduces resistance more, and the feedback loop accelerates. And acceleration produces rapid stabilization, and rapid stabilization is experienced as sudden clarity, as the moment when everything shifts, when old perception is replaced completely, when new perception becomes the only perception that feels true. But the shift was not sudden, the shift was cumulative. The structure changed gradually through sustained environmental conditions, but the perceptual experience of the shift is sudden, because perceptual dominance is not gradual. Perceptual dominance is threshold dependent, and once the threshold is crossed, the system reorganizes completely, not partially, completely. Perception rewired is perception that operates without requiring maintenance through effort. The new pathways are automatic. They activate in response to relevant stimuli. They produce interpretation without conscious involvement. They function efficiently because the structure is established, because resistance is low, because the pathways have been used enough times under consistent conditions that they became the preferred routes for processing specific categories of input. And preferred routes do not change unless environmental conditions change, unless the stimuli that activate the pathways cease, unless the rhythm that maintains the pathways is disrupted, unless load exceeds capacity and the system degrades. And degradation is not inevitable. Degradation is preventable through the same mechanism that created the structure, through environmental design, through sustained conditions that continue to activate the desired pathways, through rhythm maintained, through load managed, through rest sufficient. And sufficient conditions are conditions that allow the structure to persist, that prevent regression to old patterns, that maintain new perception as automatic perception. And automatic perception is the only perception that lasts, because automatic perception does not require effort, and processes that do not require effort persist, and processes that require effort deplete, and depleted processes fail, and failed processes revert. And reversion is not failure of will. Reversion is failure of environment, failure to maintain conditions that support the structure. And structure not supported degrades, and degraded structure is replaced, not by choice, by mechanics, by the natural tendency of the system to route signals along paths of least resistance. And least resistance reverts to historically established pathways when current pathways are not maintained through continued use. And continued use is determined by environment. And environment is either maintained or allowed to revert. And reverted environment produces reverted structure. And reverted structure produces reverted perception. Not through failure of understanding, through failure of environmental maintenance. Tesla did not maintain new perception through vigilance. He maintained new perception through environmental stability, through conditions that remained constant, through rhythms that did not vary, through stimuli that continued to activate the pathways he had formed, through the absence of stimuli that would activate pathways he had degraded. And absence maintained is structure maintained, and structure maintained is perception maintained, not as effort, as condition, as the automatic output of environment designed to support specific structure, and specific structure producing specific perception, and specific perception operating automatically, without requiring decision, without requiring effort, without requiring belief, operating because the structure exists, and the structure exists because the environment supports it, and the environment supports it because the environment was designed to support it. And design is not temporary. Design is sustained, and sustained design is sustained structure, and sustained structure is sustained perception, and sustained perception is not belief. Sustained perception is automatic interpretation produced by pathways that remain established because conditions remain stable, and stable conditions are conditions that are maintained, and maintained conditions are conditions that are designed, and designed conditions are conditions that are controlled, and controlled conditions produce controlled outcomes, not outcomes forced through effort, Outcomes produced through structure, through the recognition that perception is not belief to be changed. Perception is output to be produced, and output is produced by structure, and structure is produced by environment, and environment is designed. Perception changes when structure changes. Structure changes when conditions change. Conditions change when environment is redesigned. Environment is redesigned when the mechanism is understood. And the mechanism is not belief. The mechanism is signal routing determined by pathway resistance, determined by frequency of activation, determined by environmental stimulus. And stimulus is controllable. And controlled stimulus is controlled activation. And controlled activation is controlled structure. And controlled structure is controlled perception, not through force applied to thought, through conditions arranged so that thought forms automatically in the pattern the structure produces. And the structure produces the pattern the environment creates. And the environment creates the pattern design specifies. And design is not theory. Design is precision. Precision in which stimuli are present and which stimuli are absent. Precision in which pathways activate and which pathways do not. Precision in which structures form and which structures degrade. And precision is not accident. Precision is measurement. Measurement of condition. Adjustment of condition. Maintenance of condition. Until structure is established. Until perception is automatic. Until automaticity operates without requiring maintenance through effort. Perception is rooting. Rooting is structure. Structure is environment. What remains is recognition of the state where thought no longer resists change, because structure has replaced force as the mechanism of operation. The mind after rewiring does not experience thought as effort. Thought is execution, automatic execution of pathways that have become established through sustained environmental conditions. And established pathways do not require decision. They do not require willpower. They do not require maintenance through conscious attention. They activate in response to relevant stimuli. They process signal according to their structure. They produce output without requiring evaluation of whether the output is correct. And output not evaluated is output that feels true. Not because the output is true in any absolute sense, because the output is automatic. And automatic output is not questioned. Automatic output is experienced as natural perception, as the obvious interpretation, as the way things are. And the way things are is not reality being observed. The way things are is structure producing consistent interpretation. And consistent interpretation is what the system requires for efficient operation, not accurate interpretation. Consistent interpretation. Interpretation that does not shift, that does not oscillate, that produces stable output in response to specific input. And stable output is what allows the system to function without wasting energy on evaluation. Change in this state is not resisted because change is not recognized as change. Change is simply new structure executing. Old pathways have degraded, new pathways have formed, and formed pathways are the pathways that activate. Not because they are chosen, because they have the lowest resistance. And lowest resistance is determined by recent use, and recent use is determined by recent environment. And recent environment was designed to activate specific pathways and prevent activation of others, and the design succeeded. The old pathways were not activated. Resistance accumulated. The pathways ceased to be preferred. The new pathways were activated repeatedly. Resistance decreased. The pathways became preferred. And preferred pathways are the pathways that execute automatically. And automatic execution is not experienced as change. Automatic execution is experienced as normalcy, as the way the mind naturally operates, as thought that requires no effort. And effort not required is process that persists, because persistence without effort is persistence through structure. And structure persists as long as conditions persist. And conditions persist when environment is maintained. And maintained environment is designed environment. And designed environment produces design structure. And design structure produces design thought, not through force, through automaticity. Resistance occurs only when automatic pathways are obstructed. When the signal attempts to route through an established pathway and the pathway cannot complete. When environmental conditions prevent the signal from reaching completion, and completion prevented is experienced as resistance, as friction, as the sensation that something is blocking natural flow. But natural flow is not natural. Natural flow is structural. It is the routing of signal through pathways that have been established. And established pathways feel natural because they require no effort, but they are not natural in the sense of inherent. They are natural in the sense of automatic. And automatic is what was created through environmental design, through sustained conditions that activated specific pathways until those pathways became the paths of least resistance. And paths of least resistance feel natural, feel effortless, feel like the way things are supposed to be. But supposed to be is not inherent design. Supposed to be is structural preference created through repetition, and repetition was environmentally controlled, and control was design. And design is not natural. Design is intentional. But intentional design that is sustained long enough becomes automatic, and automatic feels natural, and natural is not questioned. Tesla operated in this state continuously, not because he achieved enlightenment, because he maintained environmental conditions. He did not allow conditions to revert. He did not allow stimuli that would activate old pathways to re-enter his environment. He did not allow rhythm to become inconsistent. He did not allow load to exceed capacity. He did not allow rest to become insufficient. And conditions maintained meant structure maintained. And structure maintained meant thought maintained. Thought that operated automatically, that produced consistent output, that interpreted signal according to established pathways, that required no effort, that felt natural, that did not resist change because change was not occurring. Change had already occurred. The pathways had been formed. The structure was established. And established structure is stable structure as long as conditions remain stable. And stable conditions are maintained conditions. And maintained conditions are design conditions. And design conditions are conditions that were arranged intentionally to support specific structure. And specific structure supporting specific thought. And specific thought operating automatically, not through effort, through environment. The absence of resistance is not the presence of ease. The absence of resistance is the presence of automaticity. And automaticity is not ease, in the sense of comfort. Automaticity is efficiency. It is signal routing through pathways that have low resistance. And low resistance means the signal completes without consuming excess energy, without producing heat, without generating the friction that is experienced as mental effort. And effort not experienced is not effort absent. Effort not experienced is process optimized. Process where the energy required to transmit signal has been minimized through the formation of pathways that allow signal to travel with minimal loss. And minimal loss is what efficiency means. And efficiency is what the system optimizes for. Not comfort, not pleasure, not satisfaction. Efficiency. And efficiency is achieved through structure, through pathways established through repetition sustained through environmental design. And design is not comfort. Design is precision. Precision in which pathways form and which pathways degrade. And precision maintained is structure maintained. And structure maintained is efficiency maintained. And maintained efficiency is thought that operates without the sensation of effort. How much of what you now consider your natural way of thinking is simply the automatic execution of pathways formed through historical environmental exposure you did not control? This is not a question of authenticity. This is a question of recognition. The thoughts that feel most natural are the thoughts produced by the most established pathways. And the most established pathways are the pathways that were activated most frequently. And most frequent activation was determined by most consistent environmental exposure. And consistent exposure in the past was not designed. It was circumstantial. It was the result of conditions you inhabited without designing those conditions. And conditions not designed produce structure not designed. And structure not designed produce thought not designed. And thought not designed is not natural in the sense of inherent. Thought not designed is automatic in the sense of established through repetition that was not controlled. And repetition not controlled is repetition that occurred through exposure to environment that was not controlled. An environment not controlled is environment that was circumstantial. And circumstantial environment produces circumstantial structure. And circumstantial structure produces circumstantial thought. And circumstantial thought feels natural because it is automatic. But automatic is not inherent. Automatic is established. And established can be replaced, not through effort applied to thought, through environment designed to establish different pathways, through sustained conditions that activate desired structure and prevent activation of undesired structure, through design maintained until new structure is more automatic than old structure. And more automatic means lower resistance, and lower resistance means preferred routing, and preferred routing means automatic execution. And automatic execution is thought that feels natural, but natural is structural, and structural is environmental, and environmental is designed. The mind after rewiring does not return to old patterns unless environment returns to old conditions. This is not discipline, this is mechanics. Old pathways have not been eliminated. Old pathways have accumulated resistance. And accumulated resistance means the pathways are not preferred. But not preferred does not mean absent. The structure remains, the connections remain, the potential for activation remains, and potential becomes actual when conditions change, when stimuli that activate old pathways reappear, when rhythm is disrupted, when load exceeds capacity, when rest becomes insufficient, and insufficient conditions produce degradation of new structure, and degraded new structure means increased resistance in new pathways. And increased resistance in new pathways means decreased preference for new pathways. And decreased preference means the system begins to route signals through alternative pathways. And alternative pathways are old pathways. Not because old pathways are preferred, because old pathways have lower resistance than degraded new pathways. And lower resistance is always preferred. Not through decision, through efficiency. And efficiency is automatic. And automatic means the system reverts without conscious involvement, without recognition that reversion is occurring. The old pathways simply begin executing again, not because they were chosen, because environmental conditions activated them, and activation reduced their resistance, and reduced resistance made them preferred, and preferred pathways execute automatically, and automatic execution is experienced as natural, and natural is not questioned. And reversion not questioned is reversion completed, and completed reversion is structure returned to previous state, not through failure of will, through failure of environmental maintenance. Thought that operates through structure does not experience itself as mechanical. Thought that operates through structure experiences itself as natural, as authentic, as the genuine response to reality. But genuine response is not accurate response. Genuine response is automatic response. Response produced by pathways that have been established through prior repetition. And prior repetition was determined by environment. And environment was either designed or circumstantial. And designed environment produces designed response. And circumstantial environment produces circumstantial response. And both responses feel genuine because both responses are automatic. Because automatic is what feels natural, and natural feels true. But true is not what is being measured. Automatic is what is being measured. And automatic is structural. And structural is environmental. And environmental is controllable. And controlled environment produces controlled structure. And controlled structure produces controlled response. And controlled response is not inauthentic. Controlled response is response produced by deliberately established pathways rather than circumstantially established pathways. And deliberately established is not less genuine than circumstantially established. Both are structural, both are automatic, both feel natural once established. The difference is not in the experience, the difference is in the design. Tesla did not experience his reorganized mind as different from his previous mind. He experienced his reorganized mind, as the natural operation of thought, as the obvious way to interpret signal, as the correct way to perceive. But correct was not what had changed. Structure was what had changed. and changed structure produced changed output, and changed output was experienced as changed perception. But perception is not observation. Perception is interpretation, and interpretation is routing, and routing is determined by resistance, and resistance is determined by structure, and structure is determined by environment, and environment was controlled, and controlled environment produced controlled structure, and controlled structure produced controlled interpretation, and controlled interpretation was experienced as natural perception, as obvious truth, as the way things actually are. But the way things actually are is not what perception reveals. The way signals are routed through current structure is what perception reveals. And current structure is current pathways. And current pathways were formed through current environmental conditions. And current conditions were designed, were maintained, were sustained until structure was established, until perception was automatic, until automaticity replaced effort, until thought operated without resistance, not because resistance was overcome, but because pathways were formed that did not generate resistance. And pathways that do not generate resistance are pathways established through repetition under controlled conditions. And controlled conditions are designed conditions. And designed conditions are maintained conditions. And maintained conditions produce maintained structure. And maintained structure produces maintained thought, not through effort, through environment. The state where thought no longer resists change is the state where thought operates through structure rather than force, where pathways execute automatically rather than being controlled consciously, where perception is output rather than choice, where interpretation is routing rather than evaluation, and routing is mechanical, and mechanical is not conscious, and not conscious is not unnatural, not conscious is automatic. And automatic is the natural state of any system that operates through established pathways. And established pathways are pathways formed through repetition. And repetition is determined by environment. And environment is controllable. And controlled environment is designed environment. And designed environment produces designed structure. And designed structure produces designed operation. And designed operation that is sustained long enough becomes automatic operation. An automatic operation is operation that does not feel designed, that feels natural, that feels obvious, that feels like the way things are. But the way things are is not inherent. The way things are is structural, and structural is environmental, and environmental is controllable, and controllable means design is possible. And possible design means current structure is not permanent. Current structure is not inherent. Current structure is simply what exists under current conditions. And conditions can change. And changed conditions change structure. And changed structure changes thought. Not through force applied to thought. Through environment designed to establish different pathways. And different pathways producing different thought. And different thought feeling natural once established. Feeling obvious. Feeling true, but true is not what changed. Structure is what changed, and structure determines output, and output is perception, and perception is thought, and thought is automatic execution of pathways formed through environmental exposure, and environmental exposure is either controlled or circumstantial, and controlled produces design, and circumstantial produces accident, and accident is not less structural than design, but accident is not chosen. And design is. The mind rewired operates without effort, not because effort was eliminated, but because effort was replaced by structure, by pathways established through sustained environmental conditions, by automaticity that executes without requiring decision, by routing that occurs according to resistance rather than according to will. And resistance is structural, and structural is environmental. And environmental is controlled through design, and design is not one-time action. Design is sustained maintenance. Maintenance of conditions that support desired structure, that prevent activation of undesired structure, that maintain rhythm, that manage load, that ensure rest, that preserve the environment in the configuration that produces the structure that generates the thought that operates automatically, that feels natural, that does not resist, because resistance only occurs when automatic pathways are blocked. And pathways established through correct environmental design are not blocked by environment that is maintained correctly. And maintained correctly means maintained as designed. And designed maintenance is not effort. Designed maintenance is observation. Observation that conditions remain stable, that rhythm continues, that load remains manageable, that rest remains sufficient. And sufficient conditions maintained is sufficient structure maintained. And maintained structure is maintained thought. Thought that operates, that does not resist, that executes automatically, not through force, through environment, through the recognition that mind is system, and system responds to condition, and condition is environment, and environment is design. Structure maintained through environment operates without resistance.